1981 in Italy, a man tried to kill the Pope. All evidence suggests that he didn't act alone, yet to this day, we don't know what really happened or who was behind this murder attempt. However, looking closer at the facts, they all seem to point towards a certain three-letter agency. Now, before we begin, I want to be clear that this is just my theory, my own speculation, and it shouldn't be taken too seriously. Anyway, the only person convicted for this attempted murder was Mehmet Ali Ağca. So let's start with him and look into his background. He was born in Turkey, and at the time of the shooting, he was only 23. He had a difficult childhood, he suffered from seizures until he was 10, and even after that, he had some nervous attacks where he wouldn't speak to anyone. His family was quite poor, and he never got any real help for these health issues. On top of that, his father died when he was only 8 years old, so Ağca would eventually start working after school to help out. His mother describes him as quite lonely. He had no girlfriend, and it looks like he didn't have many friends because he was often hanging out on his own. He attended his first and secondary school in Malaysia, and at the time the city was split into factions. One side was taken over by left-leaning activists, while the other side was taken over by Grey Wolves, which was a right-wing group. And that's the side where Ağca lived. So it is speculated that Ağca might have actually been exposed to the Grey Wolves and the right-wing politics at quite an early age. But who are the Grey Wolves? The group was founded in the 60s, and they mainly engage in urban guerrilla warfare towards communists. Reportedly, they worked closely with the Turkish government and were also associated with Operation Gladio. Now, let's look at the founder of the Grey Wolves, Alparslan Türkeş. There is no way I'm saying that correctly. Anyway, this man has a really interesting background. He spent a lot of time in the US. He first participated in a guerrilla training and then working for the US government at the Pentagon. Around 1958, he returned to Turkey, participated in a coup to seize power, openly admitting he was the leader of this coup. He then got arrested, charged, and sentenced to death. But someone came to his rescue, and that man was Ruzi Nazar, a CIA officer, who told the Turkish authorities that the US government wouldn't be too happy if this man dies. So the question is, who is Ruzi Nazar? Let's look. Well, as I said, he was a CIA officer conducting various missions for the CIA in Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. He was a close friend to Alparslan, and he had close ties to right-wing Turkish organizations providing funding and ideological support. Okay, so I guess now we know who was running the Grey Wolves, potentially. So now let's step into conspiracy territory. It appears that the Grey Wolves might have had close ties to CIA, but the CIA in the 60s and the 70s, as we know, was working on mind control projects like the MK Ultra. It also appeared that maybe Ağca was in touch with the Grey Wolves from a young age. And considering his childhood, his health issues, the fact that he had no father figure, the fact that he was lonely and didn't have many friends, and also maybe the mother was a bit absent because she had to work and support the family, he would have been an easy target for this kind of organizations. But anyway, these are just speculation. Let's go back to the facts. In 1976, he enrolls to University of Ankara, but an interesting thing happens in 1977 when he decides, following a friend's suggestion, to travel to Beirut for a 40-day training in guerrilla fighting and tactics. Now, why would he do that? And also, who paid for it? As we can see, like, he had to travel first to Damascus to meet with this friend, and then they would travel to Beirut and participate in this training. Was the training free? Maybe. And maybe he had the money to travel, I don't know. Maybe he did. Anyway, what's another fact is that during those years, during the 70s, the CIA had a strong presence in Beirut. And I would imagine that if there was a training camp in the area, the CIA would have known. But is it possible that they also had connection inside those training camps? And this is just speculation again, and we'll never know, but it's possible that the CIA and Ağca, being at the same time in the same place, might have come in contact. We can't really know what happened, but what we know is that in December of that very same year, a bank account was opened in his name and $2,000 were deposited into this bank account. Now, since this was the 80s and it was Turkey, that was quite a large amount of money, so where was it coming from? Why was Ağca receiving this money and who paid him? We don't know. Anyway, after only 1 year at the University of Ankara, he moves to Istanbul. It is again reported that he's smart, he likes to read, but he doesn't really attend classes. Instead, he just hangs out at Marmara Cafe. The cafe in those days was strongly associated with right-wing groups and apparently had a mural of a grey wolf on one of the walls. And this leads us to 1979, when Ağca kills a man, a left-leaning journalist. On the evening of the 1st of February, the man is shot in his car on his way back home from work. Allegedly, one of Ağca's friends from the Marmara Cafe wanted this man dead and provided the gun for the job. But this is just speculation, because in the end, only Ağca will be charged for this crime. In the aftermath of the killing, Ağca decides to live in Istanbul. He travels around a little bit until he is arrested in June at the Marmara Cafe. He's sentenced to death, but apparently while he's in prison, he starts implying that he might be naming other people. Whether this is true or not, I'm not sure, but in October there's a first attempt to get him out of prison. The first attempt isn't successful, but the second is. So in November, Ağca managed to escape from a high-security prison. 17 people will later be charged for facilitating his escape, 14 of which were prison guards. Now let's pause here for a moment, because on paper this is supposed to be a 20-year-old student. Yes, he's into right-wing politics, yes, he clearly has connection to the Grey Wolves, and yes, someone manipulated him or convinced him to commit a murder. But also someone desperately wants him out of prison. Why is that? And when I mean desperately, I mean they tried twice from a high security prison. At least 17 people were implicated that we know of which 14 were prison guards. So what did the prison guards gain from helping him? Because they risked their job and their freedom. Were they paid or were they working for someone? Who was giving the order? And also, if they were paid, how much was Ağca's freedom worth? And why was it so important to get him out of there? Did he really have information and names that he was going to reveal after the sentence? Or was he an asset? But it gets even weirder, because the day after escaping a high-security prison, Ağca's main concern is an approaching visit of the Pope to Turkey. And he's so concerned about it that he feels the need, the next day of escaping prison, to write a letter threatening to kill the Pope. Now, I'm really speculating here, but if you escape a death sentence, would your main concern the next day be to write a letter threatening the Pope? No, man, you have to run. Run for your life, run for freedom, try to escape the country. I don't know. Why are you writing this letter? So it's a fair question to ask. If someone was instructing him to write the letter, clearly he was being helped. And I would imagine that the next day he's hiding somewhere at somebody's place. Maybe that person is telling him to write the letter? Was this meant to be a threat to the Pope from somebody else, maybe? So from this point onwards, Ağca will be traveling around. He will be staying sometimes in luxury hotels. He will travel all over. And he will even go on holiday twice. But just to be clear, again, he's sentenced to death. He escaped a high security prison. Everyone is looking for him. The Interpol has been alerted. And yes, he has connection probably, and yes, he has a fake passport. Still, if your mission, if you think, and if you want to kill the Pope, Why would you travel around and go on holiday for a year and a half? First of all, who's paying for it? And second, if you want to kill the Pope, go to Italy and do it. Why are you going on holiday? Why are you risking being caught by the international police while you're traveling around? Did Ağca really wanted to kill the Pope? So anyway, he travels around. He goes to Iran, he gets a fake passport, he travels to Bulgaria, France, Belgium, Britain, Hungary. Then he was spotted in Tunisia. He stayed 2 weeks in a luxury hotel. He then took a ferry to Sicily. He was in Rome in late December 1980 and early January 1981. Then in 1981 he continues traveling. He goes to Austria. It is speculated that while in Austria he possibly got his gun and then he re-entered Italy. In April he booked a last-minute 2 weeks holiday to Mallorca in Spain. So he spent 2 weeks there, he took tours, and apparently he spent a lot of time playing shooting games. Then in May he flies back to Milan, he goes back to Rome, and on the 13th of May the shooting happens. A weird thing that happened in April is that he enrolled to a university in Perugia, Italy, and that's like a really weird time to enroll to university. Like, do they really accept you in April? But anyway, he only attended one class and left, never to be seen again. So the big question again is, who was paying for this? Because later the Italian police estimated that this must have cost him at least $50,000. Some people speculated that he was dealing with drugs, but I don't think so. Ağca needed to stay out of trouble. I personally think that someone already told him that he needs to be in Italy, ready to take action. I don't know if he knew that he had to shoot the Pope, probably yes. And he needed to stay out of trouble. So if you're wanted by Interpol, you're not gonna go and sell drugs because that's too risky. Anyway, going back to the timeline, on the afternoon of the 13th May, at around 5:17 p.m., he fires the shots. He tries to escape, but someone stopped him. He's caught, and the authorities find a paper instruction in his pockets. Looking at the paper, it seems the plan ideally was for him to escape, take a train and leave. But clearly things didn't go as planned. Anyway, his trial begins in July and it only lasts 3 days. There's not much to report during the trial, but what happens afterwards is quite interesting. So Ağca is sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison plus additional 10 years, which are then converted into 1 year in a solitary confinement. During his trial, Ağca did not reveal any information, he didn't name any names, and he didn't give any details. However, it is clear that he was not acting alone. Italian authorities opened an investigation into his connections, so even though Ağca's trial was over, he was still part of an open investigation. The problem Italian authorities were facing was that although it was clear that more people were involved, they didn't have any clues. So Ağca spends the first year in solitary confinement, and things get interesting. He receives a lot of visits from the Italian intelligence, the Turkish intelligence, and also the US intelligence. But Ağca also claimed that Francesco Pazienza has visited him while in solitary confinement. So who is this man? Well, he was a SISMI officer, that's the Italian intelligence. He also worked with the French secret services, the CIA, of course, why not? And he also had ties to Freemasons and was involved in various scandals that we'll talk about later. So this guy, along with all the intelligence agents, were visiting Ağca during his solitary confinement. But Ağca's solitary confinement wasn't really that bad. He was given a radio, a TV, and even a private bathroom. So I'm thinking that the Italian prison guards must have really liked the guy who tried to kill the Pope. But in 1982, something interesting happens because Ağca decides to break his silence and finally reveals that the Bulgarians ordered him to kill the Pope. The Bulgarian plot basically says that the KGB wanted the Pope dead. According to the KGB and whatever was going on through the communist minds, killing the Pope would weaken the Solidarność movement in Poland, which was anti-communism. No, it wouldn't. Anyway, there is a very detailed article that debunks the whole Bulgarian plot. But in those years, this became the most prominent explanation of what happened and who was working with Ağca. And three specific writers pushed for it. The first one is Claire Sterling. She was the first one to break the story, and she even made a strong duo with Paul Hans, monopolizing the coverage of this Bulgarian connection. They pushed this story so much that it was almost considered unpatriotic for anyone to disagree. Now, let's look into Paul Hans. He was a writer, as we know, but guess what? He was working for the CIA. Who would have thought? Now, as you can see, he was also a broadcaster for Radio Free Europe, where he met Nazar. Nazar is the other CIA officer, the one funding right-wing Turkish groups. Now let's look at the third writer, Michael Ledin. Now, Michael wasn't working for the CIA, but he closely worked with the US government and the military. Then he moved to Rome, where he collaborated with the Italian intelligence agency, the same one where Francesco Pazienza was working while he was visiting Ağca in prison. It also came out that Michael was involved in a disinformation campaign, but that's another story. So this is just a recap of all the people involved so far and how they are all connected somehow to each other. Now, let's move to 1983 when the Pope visited Ağca. They talked for a while alone, and the Pope will later admit that he doesn't believe in the Bulgarian connection, but he doesn't give any further details. What the Pope will reveal years later is that Ağca couldn't believe that he didn't kill him. He was quite confident in his abilities and he couldn't understand how the Pope survived. So they talk about religion and a greater power that must have guided the bullets. And interestingly, Ağca in the future will convert to Christianity. But let's focus on 1985 instead. So after claiming in 1983 the Bulgarian connection, Ağca gave some names. But many believe that those names, along with information that Ağca had about these people, were being fed to him by somebody else. That's because of the many discrepancies in his story, and in fact none of these people will be charged with any crime. So in 1985, 3 Bulgarians and 5 Turks stand trial, and during the trial Ağca testifies, changing the whole story and blaming the US government along with the Vatican. According to him, they made up the Bulgarian plot, and he also names 3 people: Henry Kissinger, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, and Francesco Pazienza. Now, has Ağca had a change of heart after talking with the Pope and getting an interest in Christianity? Was he finally saying the truth? The thing with Ağca is that he claimed many things over many years. One time he showed up claiming that he was the Messiah, so he can't be trusted. However, let's look into these people. So we already know Pazienza, but let's look into the Archbishop. He's originally from the US, but moves to Rome in 1959 and works with the 2 previous popes. In 1968, he is appointed Secretary of the Vatican Bank, and just 3 years later, he is promoted president, having no previous experience in banking. In 1981, just a few months after being shot, the Pope decides to promote him to vice president of the Vatican City-State. But only a year later, in 1982, Paul's luck seemed to have run out. He is involved in the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, and eventually the Vatican will pay out £145 million in a settlement. In just a very few words, Banco Ambrosiano was one of Italy's largest private banks. It had close ties to the Vatican Bank, sharing the same directors and therefore the same shady activities. In 1982, a scandal exploded, exposing over $1 billion missing. As you can imagine, it was extremely bad, but it also exposed the ties to the P2 scandal. Now, P2 was basically the Italian Freemasonry. It was a secret society, it acted like a deep state. It was also revealed that behind the many attacks that happened in those years in Italy and were blamed on the left was actually the right-wing P2 movement that was creating the so-called strategy of tension. As you can see, it had members everywhere, the police, the military, but also the government. Francesco Pazienza was possibly a member, but it is strongly suggested that he had ties and worked with the P2 members. The director of Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank had also really strong ties to the P2 members. So you see why it was bad, and the Vatican was being part of this huge scandal. Now, let's go back for a moment to 1979 when Ağca sent the letter threatening the Pope. Because this scandal exploded in 1982, but investigation into Banco Ambrosiano started in the late 70s. This newspaper mentions how Emilio Alessandrini was killed shortly after being assigned to the Banco Ambrosiano investigation. This happened in January of 1979. He was shot while in his car, like the Turkish journalist killed by Ağca. And guess what? A leftist group claimed responsibility. Now, this is what makes me question whether the letter that Ağca sent was genuine, or was it a way from someone from Banco Ambrosiano to send a message to the Pope, like, work with us or else. Now, another interesting figure is Licio Gelli. He was at some point, I think, the head of this secret society, and he's implicated in all these scandals. He also allegedly was working with the CIA during those years. Again, this is just speculation, but while I was speculating, I was thinking what could possibly be the motive. First and foremost, these were the years of the Cold War, and I think the intention was to blame Eastern Europe and turn the population against the government. And specifically, I think that Poland was the target. The Solidarność movement in Poland was an anti-communist movement, and it was growing quite fast. And I think that they, whoever they is, needed something truly bad to happen in Poland to make Polish people finally revolt against the communist government. Lech Wałęsa was the leader of Solidarność, and guess what? Ağca was involved in a plot to kill Lech Wałęsa. But this plot didn't go ahead because they found a better target. So why the Pope? As you saw, there was a deep state and they were all implicated. And I'm guessing, and I'm just assuming, that possibly the P2 people were working closely maybe with the mafia, maybe with the Vatican, maybe with the CIA. Maybe, and just maybe, considering what happened with Banco Ambrosiano, they were using the Vatican state for money laundering. Maybe, probably not, but maybe. And another thing is that for 455 years, the Vatican state has been ruled only by Italian popes. So for the first time after almost 5 centuries, they got an outsider. And the thing is that this new pope, he wasn't even living in Italy. Yes, he's been in Italy before, he's been in Rome, he's been at the Vatican, but he was not living there. So he came and he was thrown into this new reality, not knowing the rules. So maybe he started looking around, maybe he saw something he didn't like, maybe he wanted to change things. Maybe that was not allowed. But something interesting happened. So I collected information, I looked into the story, I made my own conclusion, and only afterwards I found something really interesting. So I haven't looked into it properly, I haven't put it into the script, but it is too juicy not to share.